So I figured we'd start with a quick piece of grim news, so to speak. As of today, recording the show, we've crossed the 800,000 deaths to COVID milestone in the United States.
I did see that.
I don't really have anything else to say about it other than just calling attention to it, especially among the detection of the Omicron variant in multiple states. And you know what? We've harped on it plenty of times in the past, but if you're eligible to get vaccinated and you have any questions about it, talk to your doctor about it and figure out what game plan the two of you decide.
Yep. Make a path forward.
Yep. With that out of the way, I figured an interesting topic, and I don't have a lot of structure around it, but an interesting topic is just thinking about the dynamics of family. You know, there are many conversations to be had around it, especially when you think about the sociological definitions of nuclear family versus the kind of family that you craft around relationships and associations and all. Just thought it would be an interesting topic. I did start to write something, but it's just kind of free flowing, and I don't have a full conclusion. But I thought I might read it first and then just see where the conversation goes. Sound good to you?
It does.
So what I put down was kind of a general feeling around surrounding yourself with certain types of people. It wasn't specifically focused on family, but the thought of how we define a family kind of played into it. So with that out of the way, with the introduction out of the way, I'm just going to go ahead and read it first. Republican, Democrat, Independent, Christian, Atheist, Muslim, Jew. We use these words to identify with a philosophical view, a perspective, a belief about the world in which we reside, a way in which we make sense of the actions and events we watch unfold, believing they serve some greater purpose or framework in which the world makes sense. We fold these ideas into our identity. We become an embodiment of these principles in ways that we cannot always articulate or explain. We become labels in an effort to be understood. An unfortunate result of accepting labels is the binary quantification such labels ascribe to our views. We become the stereotypical embodiment of the label instead of the nuanced existence of the individual. We are placed in the category of socialist, insurrectionist, American, Christian, fanatic. Take your pick. I wholeheartedly believe in a better version of tomorrow. A day in which all people are treated with the basic dignity and respect that should be afforded any human being existing in this world. A day in which we proclaim humanity first and ideology last. A day that seems so far out of reach that it perplexes even the most pessimistic of perspectives. A day that at this point seems destined to never exist. Yet I still posit that the day will come that we awake from this recurring nightmare, that we eventually realize the only truth that can exist, that above all else we are human beings, that we should be afforded the same basic rights of existence that the Founding Fathers envisioned in creating the framework from which we are afforded the luxury of questioning today's shortcomings. The United States of America was founded on the idea that all people, regardless of background, are created equal. We have not, unfortunately, lived up to that ideal in a variety of ways. Yet, we are in a unique place where we are provided a clear and direct opportunity to make such a statement ring throughout the world, to set the example, so to speak, that the formation of a society and its subsequent refinements are a core component of existence, a requisite framework for understanding and evolving the world in which we live. I dare to dream of the day that we look upon one another with compassion and a desire for understanding. A day in which we recognize the basic existence of another human, not a label. A day of recognition. A day of peaceful coexistence. It was long, and there are a lot of things we can unpack out of that. And there are a couple of, I would say, maybe slightly untrue general truths as far as how the founding of the U.S. originated on the basis of everyone being equal, because we kind of didn't do that at first.
Mm-hmm.
But the words are there, right? The idea and the concept was present, even if it wasn't executed appropriately. So I do recognize there are some shortcomings in the way it's written, but it felt like a fairly apt summary of a lot of the things that we had talked about over the past few shows.
Yeah, the concept was correct, even though the execution was not.
Right.
It reminded me of a quote from Marjane Satrapi, and I only know that she exists because of this quote. She's an Iranian graphic novelist, and she said, "The world is not divided between East and West. You are American, I am Iranian. We don't know each other, but we talk and we understand each other perfectly. The difference between you and your government is much bigger than the difference between you and me. And the difference between me and my government is much bigger than the difference between me and you. And our governments are very much the same."
Interesting.
Yeah,
I like that.
It came to mind as you were talking about it, and how we apply certain labels to ourselves so that we can help people to understand who we are, and then sometimes we become subject or slaves to those labels, and we forget that probably the difference between you and me can be any two people in the entire world, is closer than the difference between you and your government specifically, and that person and their government.
And I think it's also probably poignant to point out that what we see as a representation of government is driven in a way to be divisive, and not trying to say the government has the best interests, of course, because we've covered that ad nauseum. But even when there is alignment on views, what is shared publicly tends to be crafted in a way to not illustrate that alignment, but to focus in on the most divisive piece of information possible.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of those areas where it's difficult to really hone in on how to kind of wade through that. The presentation of information, we've mentioned it in a number of different ways, but just as a general rule of thumb, the presentation of information tends to craft the reality of the person receiving that information. I think that makes sense. I think I said it right. The way the information is presented influences the way it is interpreted.
Yes. Yeah,
that's a more succinct way to say it.
Yeah, I was still digesting the first way you said it.
And as a result, even when we're talking about interpersonal relationships and communication, the way information is presented still influences the interpretation on the other side. So regardless of how aligned views may be, because of the nature of human interaction, there could still be a phrasing issue or something that triggers a response that was not desired, even though there's actually a common alignment or theme running between the views.
Yeah, I was recently thinking and talking about how if you have a single person, you probably won't have any communications to yourself. You understand your own thoughts typically. But as soon as you add a second person to a relationship, so a relationship is with a second person, you automatically are going to run into communication issues. It's bound to happen. There's no way that doesn't happen. And when we talk to one another, we don't necessarily, we talk with the intention of communication, and sometimes we fail. Sometimes we fail miserably, but we often forget that there are certain entities when communicating to us have worded things precisely in such a way that we think a certain thing, even though the words that were used were not necessarily communicating the way they wanted us to think. I don't want it to sound like they're trying to brainwash us or trick us into something, but certain things are communicated in certain ways to influence how we take that information in.
The source of information certainly has to be judged for intent. And judged may be the wrong word. You have to understand the motive of who is presenting information to you. And if you don't understand the motive, or if you can't find a motive, or if you just don't know the person well enough to understand their motives in general, how do you figure that out? And so this goes back to labels, right? How we make sense of the world tends to be taking something we see or interpret or understand and drawing parallels to those things that we don't, or trying to classify something within the scope of what we know that label to mean to us. And so if we go back to socialist was one of the ones I had in the writing just for the sake of ease of conversation. How many, and I know we've mentioned it on the show before anyway, but how many times has socialist been used as a derogatory term that's immediately equated with an extreme such as communism?
Yes.
I mean, it's
all the time.
All the time.
All of the time.
And on the flip side of it, we've done the same kind of thing with fanatic, because fanatic has a negative connotation. There's a reason it has over time developed such a negative connotation, but at a fundamental level, a fanatic is just someone who is extremely passionate and zealous about a specific thing, generally speaking, right?
Yeah.
You wouldn't say that someone is a fanatic about comic books. You would say they are, you might say fanatic, but that's typically not the first word that comes to mind. It's not how it's used more often than not. It's used more to illustrate a extreme religious view or extreme philosophical view.
Yeah, I think it was originally used for a religious maniac.
Yeah, it sounds about right. And all of this created this idea in my head about what is it that we have, that we allow ourselves to be bound to other people. That was kind of where my thought process led originally before I settled on the idea of using family as the conversation piece. But it is broader than that. What is it that keeps us within the spheres of certain people, even when we truly do not identify with a person's views or ideas, or maybe even have apprehension about them? When we talk about general relationships with someone that's an acquaintance or maybe a friend, typically we just talk about severing the relationship and moving on, right?
Yeah.
But then there's a point where we reach a threshold where that's no longer the go-to. And I can't completely pinpoint it as family, because there are cases, of course, otherwise. But what is it that creates that feeling of, I have to accept this person even though I don't accept their views or the way they carry themselves or present themselves?
Well, certainly.
Did I lose you?
At some point, there is, if a family, if a certain person behaves in a certain way, you do cut ties with them. Like there are certain things where we will cross, we say, okay, that is a line crossed. It doesn't matter that you're my family member. I no longer want to associate with you. I no longer want you in my life or in your influence or even communicate with you. And
All right, now I hear audio from your side again.
Yay! What was the last thing you heard me say?
That was strange as hell.
Yeah.
I actually didn't hear anything after I posed the question.
Oh, so I heard what you said, and I was like going right into a thing, and now I don't remember what I was talking about. It's in the recording, though.
Yeah, I'll put it together for sure. And I'm going to interject a quick statement just in case it doesn't flow well. So let's pause for a second, and I'll add the statement.
Okay.
So for some reason, just in case the things seem to not flow well, I've experienced a couple of technical difficulties with dropouts. Just want to mention it in case in editing I find that I need to leave this warning in there for how it sounds in post. So the question I had posed was basically, what is it that makes us accept others as a required part of our lives when we don't accept their views or thoughts? And that was the last thing that I remember asking before we had a technical difficulty.
Yeah, I think that there's certainly a social expectation that we accept that those that have different views than us, that are family, will continue to associate with them, even if, for all intents and purposes, you wouldn't associate with them if they were only friends or someone that you met, like in your workplace or at the gym or any other social setting. And then the line that a family member has to cross for you to not want to associate and say, set up, boundaries, and like, this is, your relationship with you is toxic. We actually wait until family members are, sometimes we don't even, we allow toxic family members in our life, and we don't set up a boundary when we should. But where we draw the lines for family is a lot more lenient than every non-family members. And so it's interesting because, I think some of it has to do with, like, actually you have shared experience. I know someone who's got siblings that they have, they won't talk to right now because their ideas are, the way they think about things are so different. He's like, I don't care that we're related. This is not something I'm okay with. And so he won't talk to certain family members because of their ideas. But there is a shared experience where, like, if this was someone who wasn't his family, he would have never been associating with them in the first place. And so there is family is not just, your family, so we are together and, I have to accept you. But there is, especially with siblings, there's shared, the shared experience that you have with a sibling is unlike any other relationship you'll ever have in life.
I'd say there's also a pretty significant component related to the general societal understanding that because we're related, I afford you greater leniency on discussions where we differ on opinion, so to speak, than I would, a random stranger, which makes sense. You may not be able to choose, the family that you're born into, but they are still family, right? And there is a relationship there that is different from your relationship with other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's understandable that there's a desire to try to maintain that relationship more so than there would be a desire to maintain a relationship with a stranger, for sure. Or just a casual acquaintance, even. And so, go ahead.
I was going to say, I do think it's based on certain shared experiences because, like, you're probably more likely to want to, you're probably more lenient with a sibling than you are with a cousin because, you have more shared experiences with a sibling. And then, whereas with a cousin, you're maybe less likely so, but because you do have similar shared experiences with cousins, but not as many as you do with a sibling. And then you might think, well, I've got this cousin that I like. I can think of, like, personally, I can think of cousins like that I've met once in my life, and if I don't ever talk to them. I'm talk to them the one time that they were at a family gathering in 1994, and if I met them on the street today, I don't even know that I would recognize them. But if we figured it out and whatever, it's like I'm not even sure that I wouldn't feel obligated to have lunch with that cousin. So, whereas it's like I take time out of my life to visit cousins closer to me for the holidays, and then even more time out of my life to visit my mom and my sister. So, yeah,
I
think it's those shared experiences.
We can certainly make the case for shared experiences. You could also change the wording and just say time spent together, in proximity.
Yeah.
Even if it's not so much a shared experience, it's just being around that person often enough, which can also explain why if you have someone who you're around all the time growing up that is not related to you, it can be a very similar type of feeling if there's a fairly distinct divergence of opinion or belief as well between you and that other person.
Yeah.
I know I put a lyric in the notes that was illustrative of this concept as well. I'll go ahead and share it. It's pulled from a Garth Brooks song called Thicker Than Blood. And the lyric was just, blood is thicker than water, but love is thicker than blood. The reason I wanted to go ahead and mention it is because what we're really talking about when we're talking about shared experiences and proximity to someone is a crafted sense of affection, which is in essence an emotional attachment, and we ascribe love to that attachment in some fashion. Would you agree?
Yeah, because I was kind of earlier thinking about, like, you may have, there's a lot of different kinds of love, and one of the thoughts I had was, like, you may become romantically in love with someone that is, for all intents and purposes, the complete opposite of you. I think maybe like a certain idea, that probably becomes problematic when your ideologies are different. And maybe I'm referring to personality differences and communication style differences. But even so, like, there are certain, when you are in love with somebody, you love somebody, there are certain things that you are willing to make accommodations with, But yeah, love does make a difference. And then I think that can be extended to brotherly love and familial love, as well as love, the love that you have in a friendship. So
yeah, and part of why I wanted to make sure I phrased it that way is because I want to clarify that love is not purely romantic involvement, right? We tend to think of it, thanks to Hallmark and others, that love has to be this thing between romantic partners, but that is not the case.
Yeah.
Love is a sense of affection for another being.
Yeah. I think what's even probably the most forgiving, maybe also abused form of love is like the unconditional love that you might have as a parent, the parent to a child, or vice versa. But I really think specifically parent to child, because there are things that parents will do for their children that they would not do for any other being on the earth, or find something acceptable under, we make that sort of accommodation as parents.
Absolutely. I was thinking about this not too long ago. I'm trying to think of how I would describe it, because the jumping to a more concerned or worst case scenario out of fear of something happening to a child is a real thing, right? it's not in most cases, I don't think it's a desire for a parent to be overprotective or to be the quote-unquote helicopter parent, right? I think it's a inability to realize rational thought processes when there's this emotional sense of urgency because of a concern, right? We create a response and an idea in our head based on this perception, and a more negative, plausible scenario than the reality of the situation may dictate. And it's especially exacerbated when you're talking about a climate and a pandemic where you hear of worst cases, and you know there's the possibility of that happening, and you've been bombarded with the notions of these things without emphasis on prevalence. And so it's difficult to say, yeah, it's a problem, but it's not that huge a problem that I need to be concerned with based on a cough, so to speak. Or, I'm trying to illustrate it with a basic example, because I think that it's really become an issue over the past year and a half, 2 years, where this concern for health and safety of a child creates a more severe response than it would, a couple of years ago, because the messaging and everything has been anxiety-inducing in general.
Yeah. I was even thinking of like some extreme cases where if you think about if you think about the worst person in the world, the people in the world that have done the worst things, and they have parents, and if those parents are alive, it's like you understand that like those parents I can't imagine that anyone condones any if you've got someone who's done committed a mass shooting or fill in the blank, any awful thing, those parents still love that child, and I can't imagine what sort of turmoil you go through as a parent who hears this person that you raised, and you've got to imagine that what did I do wrong? But that love, just because someone has done something so awful and atrocious, that love doesn't go away. It's certainly impacted forever, but it's the love doesn't go away, and that's a bit of an extreme case, but it exists.
Well, it is, but I think I want to come back to that as the next show, because it's poignant based on current events.
Yeah.
I agree, though. And the example I was using was trying to kind of relate it to child getting sick, and because of the pandemic, the first thought is worst case scenario, and so there's maybe an overemphasis on doing everything you can to confirm or deny that worst case scenario, instead of taking a breath and thinking, well, no, this is typical cold symptoms. There's no reason for me to jump to that worst case scenario other than that's what's been prevalent in messaging. Where I think what I was describing and what you were describing differ isn't the level of love for parent-child. It's the manifestation of it in a different form. Yeah. Where I was focused on this sense of overprotection, which is a problem as well if it's not recognized, versus maybe a lack of willingness to see a red flag. Is that?
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah.
I think that tracks. It's you overlook things in the latter case that maybe you wouldn't overlook in a stranger, and in the example I was using, you overanalyze things that maybe you wouldn't overanalyze in other ways. So either way, like the unifying theme is that your unconditional love for that child sends you further to an extreme view because you don't want to recognize any level of harm to that child.
Right. Some of that is biological. Some of that is I don't know where I'm going with that.
Well, it's all of it. There's certainly a biological affinity toward protecting a child, right? Offspring.
Right, preserving your own DNA.
Right, but there's also a intense psychological aspect to it of you have a responsibility for keeping this person safe because they can't do it. And then as they become more capable, it's difficult to step back from that. Like there's always this desire to continue to protect and to keep them safe because they couldn't do it on their own. And there's not a clean growing up of that responsibility from a parental side because they're always your child.
Right. We forget sometimes that we have to, like, part of growing up is, as a parent, making accommodation and in the intent of slowly letting go so that the child can be independent. I remember thinking, in my early 20s, I was like, my parents spent so long making sure that I would be okay out on my own, and now they don't want me to be out on my own because you forget to do that part.
Yeah, exactly. And part of why, so I know I've mentioned plenty of times that one of the few artists, plenty of times between you and I don't know if I've mentioned it on the show, plenty of times though that one of the few artists that I have always been able to identify with a song at different points in life in general has been Garth Brooks. There's just always been something that's what I needed to hear at that time. The same concept is actually explained in, or sung about in a song called Send 'Em On Down the Road. It's on the Man Against the Machine album, where the idea is just talking about learning to let a child do their thing, and you send them on, and you're always there for them, but recognizing that hands-off piece. And I don't have the lyrics handy. I know them well enough, but I don't want to misquote it. Just in general, I wanted to bring that in because one of the few things, just as a personality nuance, I will almost always find either a Bryan Adams or Garth Brooks song to relate to a scenario. For some reason, those are the two.
Well, I think there's, it's like as a parent, we're like, we like, the goal is to rear a intelligent, independent, self-sufficient human, and then all of a sudden, when they don't need our help anymore, we're like, well, we forget to like prepare ourselves for, like, we're so busy thinking of our children and preparing them. There's like, oh no, it's just as important as a parent to prepare yourself that you are no longer needed. It's like, it's real easy when it's diaper changing. It's so easy when it's like, oh, excuse me. It's so easy when it's potty training. It's like, as soon as you can stop changing diapers, you don't have to spend money on the diapers. You don't have to like be there for them. You don't have to check their bottoms. And, as soon as you can give them that independence, I think pretty often as parents, we're ready to be out of that sooner than they are ready to, sit on the toilet. But
oh, for sure.
You're right. So, but then we forget to do that for the other parts of life. Other parts of rearing a child.
Well, and I think it's because there's not a clear divide a lot of times that we kind of can use to gauge milestones, right? Because after that, every kid develops differently anyway. We know that there are general milestones and general age brackets and things, and there are really generalized levels of, all right, if this isn't occurring by now, it might be of concern, but it also might not, depending on this other general level of things, right?
Yeah.
And so part of the problem is that once you get past those basic physical things, it's really difficult for most people to judge things like emotional maturity or the ability to rationally approach a situation, because a lot of people can't do it themselves.
Right.
And on top of that, we have these age markers for things that do not correspond to developmental milestones. For example, we talk about the age of 18 being classified as an adult, where we know physiologically the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until the mid-20s.
Right.
Well, guess what? The prefrontal cortex is what allows us to create rational response to emotional stimulus, among other things. But that's one of its key functions.
I mean, I think there's also there's this dynamic where it's like your 9-year-old might be a lot smarter than a 13-year-old. For some reason, you get dumber as you go into, well, not for some reason. You definitely get dumber as you get older because you've got all these hormones, going through, changing your body and new interests, and, boys will do dumb things for girls and vice versa. And it's interesting.
Which the whole time we were talking about it, the big thing that kept coming back to my mind was, what are we really trying to do for the child and for ourselves as parents? And that's reach a point where across the board we're both better human beings, or that should be our goal. Like, be a decent human being. Get to this point and be able to exist in a world that you can make sense of and inject some level of good into it.
Yeah, I think you spend like 10 to 12 years teaching your child to be a decent human being, and if they haven't figured out by 12, you're kind of SOL. And the rest, like after that, is just like you're the bumpers at a bowling alley, you're the gutter bumpers. And if I sort of got derailed in my head, but it's there's probably some level of like, you're not, the type of decency as a human that you will be is maybe predeterminate to some extent, but
yeah, I disagree with that, actually. Mostly because if you just take experience, personal experience, and attempt to relate it to the arc of understanding role and place and desired purpose, and subsequently trying to manifest a certain level of success with that purpose, and then realizing that maybe that's not, like, all these different stages, right? You have development and learning and understanding, and you have this picture at a certain point of, this is what I want to do. Whatever its motivations, whatever its guidance, this is what I've settled on as how I'm going to proceed. And this is typically coinciding with some choice around college or not college, what to major in, that kind of thing, right? Because it's where you first have an ability to leverage that freedom of selection. Prior to entering college or trade school or whatever path you take, everything is mostly predetermined. I mean, you've got a handful of things you can choose from, but your path is still pretty solidly set. You know, the state says you have to have these things, and you have a handful of other topics provided by the school that you might be able to enroll in as, you know, a choice, but it's very, very limited. And then you reach this point where you have to make a decision, and that decision may be horrifically flawed. You know, it may be, I need to eat, and the only thing I can do is go get whatever job I can get and start there and figure it out as I go. It may be, well, I have to go to college because that's everything that, you know, has been beat into my skull over time, and so that's where I start, and then I drop out, and who knows where the path goes from there. Like, all of these different things are potential paths, but that point is definitely not the person you're going to be 10 years later. So if you take development up to exiting high school, sure, there are plenty of people who make who have a very solidly formed outcome at that point. I wouldn't say it's the majority, though. I would say the majority are entering that phase where they figure out the person they are versus the person they're going to become.
Honestly, that should have happened a lot sooner.
I don't think it's possible to happen sooner.
Well, where I was going with my thought was, so I didn't want to turn this into a nature versus nurture discussion, and
I'm all for it though.
Well, I feel like you've pulled us out of that, and I appreciate that. You've pulled us out of that digression, but it's, you know, I feel like by the time you've reached puberty, you know, you're going to be a decent person or you're not going to be a decent person. No, I'm talking to extremes. I'm talking at extremes right here, but the rest of growing up is, I think by the time you get to puberty, who you're going to be is who you're going to be, and the rest of growing up is like, do you have parents that are going to teach you, like, here's how you get to be who you're going to be? Here are some skills, here are the lessons that hopefully you can learn from other people's mistakes. Here are the lessons you're going to go through, and here are the things that you need to be thinking about and things that you need to be considering to be the type of person that you're going to be. Hopefully it's a decent person. But I think what you're saying actually holds quite a lot of water, because as parents, or not as parents, but there are a vast majority of parents that don't go that deep into teaching these sort of concepts to their children. You sort of have this reactionary grade of parenting instead of an intentful grade of parenting.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly good way to describe it, because the biggest piece where I think that our thought processes diverge are what it really means to be the type of person you're going to be. And depending on how you describe that or boil that down into a summary, we could be saying the same thing. Like, just because my thought of the person you're going to be includes, you know, viewpoints and opinions and things that you would not form until later in life, doesn't mean that you couldn't back that up and say, I'm going to be an open-minded or objective person, which could be where we kind of draw the line at that puberty mark, because you're not necessarily saying that your ideas and philosophies are set in stone there. You're making the argument that the type of person you're going to be going forward is kind of defined there. And I think I'm including more on top of that than what you're including at a high level.
I think so.
That's what it kind of sounds like to me.
I follow this. I think this kind of segues nicely into like the I don't know that you ever have a parent that, I don't want to say ever, but most of the parents of people who have done horrific things in life of note probably didn't rear their children to ever do that, or never expected that out of their children. And you might even look at, like, parents that are racist, even like, let's say, even have like parents that subscribe to Nazi beliefs. Like, there's plenty of those people out there, too many of those people out there, and their children don't do horrible, terrible things. And you've got some parents that are probably good folks, and their child, did something that we know them about only because of how terrible they were. And so there's a point where, as a parent, it was never your fault. And I'm not sure where we're going to go with it. I thought this was a good segue, and I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but...
So I have some thoughts there, for sure. I think that's a good teaser to say that next week's episode we'll delve into that in more detail. And the only reason I say that is because it seems like we're about to bite off a fairly significant conversation. and I want to make sure there's a little bit of a break between the two, right? Generally speaking, though, I would say the way I would characterize that and leave it hanging for the next show is that there's a very finite amount of influence that a parent has over a child's development in the first place. And that level of influence is actually shockingly low in a lot of ways.
We have a number of different ways set up for you to get in touch with us to provide feedback, ask questions, or just comment in about something we've discussed.
You can hit us up on Twitter or Instagram at untitled_hosts, or shoot an email over to untitled.hosts@gmail.com.
Or get in touch directly with Jesse at jthart.com, or get in touch with me, John, via telepathy.
If you would like to support our work or are interested in listening to our new after show feed, head over to patreon.com/theUntitledPodcast and take a look at the options we have set up.
Thank you for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed the show.
And we hope to connect with more of you as we continue this journey.
That's a wrap.